I've always heard amazing things about Montana. I just never been. And I didn't understand how you can kind of sustain being out here. But part of what I was doing is I was looking to invest in a business. And so I did kind of take into the other side of the coin going from tech is I've always believed, whether it was in ag tech or anything else, there's huge opportunity in middle America, what they call the flyover states. Like that's where the food's coming from. That's where all the stuff happening that people don't appreciate. And maybe that's where the arbitrage can happen, where if you find the right opportunity, especially as an investor, because at that point I was just going to invest in these plants and then it really helped them out with the distribution piece and figuring out how to take their model and scale it and kind of take three separate family owned plants and consolidate them and make into one larger brand. And so it was enough to get me out here. And then I met with them. Then I was going to meet processing conventions. I'm going to meet with everyone at the state level to figure out where can I add value when I have no experience in this industry.
Is that much of it? That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Carey. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post 9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists, and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills. Episode 106 features Nate Kouhana, an Army veteran and the founder and CEO of Anthem Snacks, a premium meat snack company based in Montana, which recently earned Veteran-Owned Business of the Year and is the official jerky of the UFC. Welcome. This is Veteran Made. This episode is brought to you by GoPills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time. All right. Good afternoon for me. Good morning for you, Nate Kouhana. Welcome to Veteran Made. If my hat that I ordered had been here in time, it's like supposed to be delivered right around the time that we're recording this, I would also be wearing my Anthem Snacks hat, but it's not quite here yet. But welcome, man. Good to see you.
Yeah, great meeting you and awesome. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that don't know who you are, if you could give us just a brief primer on who you are and where and when you served, and then we'll jump into Anthem Snacks.
Yeah, Nate Kouhana, originally grew up in Texas. Served from 03 to 09 on active duty, then did a couple of years in the Guard as well. 3rd Battalion, 3rd Special Forces Group. Yeah, that's kind of the background.
Awesome. I love it. And then what are you now currently? And then I kind of want to jump into the entrepreneurial journey for you, but to kind of ground everybody with what are you running now? What company is it?
Yeah, so I'm the founder and CEO of Anthem Snacks. So we are a veteran-owned meat snack company located here in Montana, and so that's what I'm currently doing now. And obviously the journey to get to this place was pretty wide.
Yeah, no doubt. What was the transition like for you immediately out of service? I know you mentioned the Guard. Was that right after active duty?
No, actually, I when I got out, I did what most vets did. You try to find your job in the private sector, getting paid better, right? That's the easiest path. So I was doing contracting stuff. I was kind of a level 3 ASOT guy on top of the free fall team. So there was work out there. The hardest part is turning down that money and starting over and starting from the bottom of the totem pole, if you will. And so I did that for a couple of years. I moved out to San Francisco. I just wanted to be in something completely different. So for me, it was I jumped into tech. There was a lot of exciting stuff going on in 2011, coming out of the financial crisis. So it was it was fun and it was just totally different. And being even though we were in a pretty flat, organization, being on a team, it's still a huge entity, the military. And so I wanted something where, they were just kind of breaking things and iterating and moving fast. And so I did that. So I was in San Francisco, but I did want to you're kind of hedging your bet at that point. You still want to do some contracting. You still want to have your clearances and everything else. So I did the Guard. I actually got kind of recruited to do the Guard. for a specific kind of skill set with the intention of I would still get deployed. It just ended up being too hard for me. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not talented enough to do something half, only on the weekends and stuff like that. Right. So I was trying to learn something new, throw myself into tech, learning that whole world. And then it almost became too overwhelming to kind of figure out once a month to go back to guard and do all that other stuff. And I really wasn't given solid effort to either one. So at that point, after a couple of years, I decided to kind of get out of the guard and just kind of rip the Band-Aid off and move on.
Was that difficult for you? I know a lot of guys coming from the soft community, it's like you're talking about, right? You're hedging your bets. You want to have those opportunities in the future should you need them. You want to keep your clearances, kind of keep your training up and all that stuff, which makes a ton of sense. But it's also, like you said, you mentioned that you get paid a lot more to do the job that you were doing in the military. And so I know that for a lot of guys, that's difficult to let go of. But you mentioned jumping into tech and getting excited at the kind of creative destruction that was coming out of the financial crisis. So was it difficult for you emotionally to let go of that run and gun life, or were you like, you know what, this is right, I'm overwhelmed, I don't want to do this, I'm going to jump headfirst into this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've played it back in my head a few different times. When I got out, I remember we were doing, so let me back up. I got wounded on my last trip, right? And so I was already confronted with, hey, can I still even do this job at this level? I was getting, so I took a grazing head shot, which, for me, I was having piercing pain when we were doing free fall jumps, especially past 12.5. So anything at like 17.5 with oxygen and everything, I mean, I couldn't do it. I was also going through the shoot house. I really didn't even know where the where the gunfire was coming from, right? And so I was under the very real, I was under no illusions that like this is affecting my job, which has consequences to teammates and everything else. So I was already grappling with that. We were doing free fall training. I think we were in Yuma at the time, and the whole financial crowd, I mean, everything was tanking. And so the only thing I kept thinking about was like, is this a good time to even get out and do this, right? And so there is a little bit of trepidation there, but kind of leaned into it. And so once I did that and I did move on, I did have that nice gap or that bridge, which is, doing the contracting piece. Once I finally said, oh, I'm going to transition to civilian life and do this other job, it was nerve wracking. You're starting from the bottom. When I went to tech, I didn't know anyone. I had no network. I had anything. And I ended up meeting one of these founders, and I told him I would intern for free, which luckily in California, they didn't let you do. You know what I mean? So he had to pay me something, and then very quickly moved up and kind of learned that. But it was all new. And like anything, when you're learning something new, you're super focused and your commitment to everything, and you're 100% committed to like giving it your best effort. If you fail, you fail. But what I'm not going to do is fail knowing I was lazy or I didn't give it everything I had. And so for me, it was exciting. It was like a fire hose, learning all that stuff. You were working around a lot of smart people in a different field. And so I was able to really just do a complete 180 from my previous life. And that kept me on edge and kept me sharp. And it was exciting at the time.
What drove you, like what pointed you in that direction? If you didn't have, connections or contacts or, any of that, like what made you say, I'm going to go to, the Bay Area, Silicon Valley and try this tech thing?
Yeah. So I had one friend. I had one friend going to Stanford. And we had talked before, and he was trying to get me to go to business school. And he was doing, I think he was working for Deloitte or Bain, one of these consulting companies. That was his transition. He immediately went in and was doing that. So it made sense for him to go to business school. I wasn't. I was contracting. And so I was like, I'm going to like reach for these abstract, something which is going to be like, oh, how do I apply business to what I previously did or what I currently do? And there's the resume building piece of it, but then there's like the actual practicality of like learning the skill set and all that. I just didn't think I was there, but I went out to visit him. And then in the process of doing that, he was in Palo Alto going to Stanford. I was just like, well, you know what? I'm just going to go to San Francisco every weekend and figure out what's going on. And I just literally packed up 2 bags, moved in. I'm like, when you have no plan B, you're just like, we're going to make this work. You know what I mean? And so you start meeting people and kind of going that route.
Yeah. So what was it like for you out there? Who did you meet? How did you get into it? And what was your experience like?
Yeah, honestly, it was crazy. I mean, to think back on it, I was hanging out with a bunch of Harvard and Stanford grads that were, they're in their early 20s. They had just graduated. I'm already 30 something. And I'm couch surfing. I'm just kind of figuring it out, meeting people, going to parties. And the good thing is you stand out so much in San Francisco coming from, our background. You're just different, which makes you interesting to them, right?
Yeah.
Because even though there are a lot of smart people, they're all kind of saying the same thing. They all have the same background and they like new, exciting stuff. Just so they were all new and exciting to me and I was new and exciting to them. And I'm not naturally a gregarious person. I'm more of an introvert. So it was tough, but I was putting myself out there because I just knew this was part of the process and you were going to have to build a network. And if it worked and it led to something great, if not, and I ended up leaving there, that'd be fine. I gave it my best effort. So it was a lot of partying. It was a lot of meeting people and couch surfing. That's how it started. And then I found an apartment and then I told my buddy I was going to move there, a buddy that was in third group with me. And he was like, well, I'm moving there too. And so he came out like 6 months later and we just got an apartment, had no furniture or anything like that, and just kind of set up shop.
How did you respond to being noticed in that way, right? Like as you're networking with a lot of folks that probably look the same, sound the same, like as you were saying, say a lot of the same things, probably believe a lot of the same things. Although there's a good amount of heterodox thought and belief out there. It just might not be readily apparent on the surface.
Yes.
But how did you bring any specific skills from the military to bear on the networking and relationship building aspect of your time out there?
I mean, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but my only experience of really putting a plan together in the military and building kind of quote unquote rapport was in doing my level 3 advanced special operations stuff when we ran sources. That was pretty much how you came to a place, you figure out how to kind of build a network and do all that. That's honestly what I was applying at that point. Other than, going to high school, playing sports and doing all that stuff where you're just trying to, but again, I'm not playing sports with these people. Occasionally doing, some sports like basketball or something like that, but it's not the same thing. You know what I mean? So you're really just kind of working your way through a plan and figuring out, hey, how do I figure out if I belong here? And in that process, you're being open with people at that time, even though, because you're right, at that time it felt like there's a lot of groupthink going on when I left, but when I got there, people were actually super interested. You could actually have discourse, you could have dialogue. They liked that you were thinking different, that you were saying things different, and I liked it, and I also appreciated that, and so that worked back then. I think Peter Thiel talked about this, right? There's so many developers and everything out there. Most of them don't have an ideology and all this other stuff. They just kind of say what it is because the peer pressure and what's going on around there. I noticed that. So when I was working with developers and the coders, which is most of the people, I wasn't in sales or any of this stuff. We got along great because we were so different and we were so interesting to each other. I wanted to learn everything about them. They wanted to learn stuff about me. Now, when I got in my first role, I did notice there were a lot of misconceptions of what they thought I was, which is, I can run these teams and I'm high-fiving people and I'm getting like big, I was like, that's not what I did in the military. That's not at all what I did. So I don't know if they had, especially my CEO thought, eventually I could run some like, sales or marketing team of like, a bunch of people. Like that's just not what it was. But as we learned about each other, I think we appreciated our differences.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's really important for that illustrates what's important for everybody, right? Like whatever you're not experienced with, whoever you don't know, whoever you haven't spent time around, wherever you haven't been, it's probably a good idea for you to go there, right? To go spend some time, to build some relationships, to gain some understanding, and to meet people where they are, right? And like the way that you just illustrated that was going both ways, which is obviously the ideal scenario. So what took you from California to Montana?
So there was a stop. There was a stop in between, which was Chicago. So as good as it was when I got to California and everything was different, I loved it. By the time I left, I kind of had my fill, right? You did start to realize, hey, everything's not new. I understand what this industry is. I understand kind of what it takes to kind of navigate through here. And as much as like the startup world was great, I was working for a 26-year-old CEO who was the first intern at Facebook, and Facebook was like on fire back then. So he had enormous pressure to be like the next, unicorn company and everything. And what came with that was, you're working for a 26-year-old. So even though decisions are getting made fast, unlike, being in the military, you're kind of going in circles because you're at the whim of like whatever pressure is being applied by some board. and some 26-year-old making those decisions. So it was a kind of a revolving door with who was coming in, coming out. I was fortunate enough to stay there, but it was kind of crazy to come from a place where, your teammates are everything to this place where everyone's kind of interchangeable and you're looking for the next best thing. And there was a lot of smoke and mirrors on the software stuff. We were B2B software, which now would be probably considered AI. It was like predictive marketing software. And it just kind of got old. Once you got over like the novelty of like what you were doing, you're just like, hey, everybody here is selling some version of this stuff. And like I found out that I didn't have, as cliche as it is, like purpose. I missed the military part of that, right? The connection piece, the day-to-day part of it. It was all, I was just kind of done with it. And for the same reason I didn't go to business school to start, which was I had no experience outside of the military, is the very reason I went running to business school, really looking for just structure, right? To really digest everything that I had been through. And then how do I leverage that going forward? Whether that's getting better on, understanding the ins and outs of all the different departments and the frameworks of doing this, to just carving out the time to like start my own thing. And I knew I wanted to do something of my own. I've always wanted to do entrepreneurship and starting my own business. And so that just gave me a reason to kind of get away from there. And when I chose business school, the business school I was going to, I didn't want a school on either coast, because I'd been done with like, drinking all the Kool-Aid from, kind of what the belief systems were.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Again, really smart, right? Put yourself in a different environment, right? Like you spend some time in that environment. Let me go get these skills, try to get this understanding that I can see from my experience here that I'm lacking, but let me go somewhere different. Let me go, where did you go in Chicago for business school?
Yep. So I went to Booth, University of Chicago, and that was great because coming from the military, there was kind of one set of beliefs and all your friends look like one thing. Going to San Francisco looked like another. Middle America, Midwest was like right up the alley, right? It was like, and you had a lot of people working in more corporate jobs. So it was a nice balance. And then to answer your question though, so I was there, and in that kind of 2 years I spent there, I was looking for all kind of business ideas. And I had another friend I was looking for and we wanted to start something. And then his dad was looking for actually a second home here in Montana. And in the process of doing that, he came across a broker who was selling 3 meat processing plants. And he asked me if I had any desire to jump in on this. And I told him, absolutely not. I said, I don't know anything about the meat industry. It just seemed crazy coming out of business school, paying all that money, building all that network, not leveraging, going back into tech, where I really thought that was going to be the value. It was like, I could go if I needed to raise money or do anything, I would kind of check all those boxes, do all that. Instead, I'm going to a place where I have no network, no military network, no tech network, no friends, really nothing. And then starting the industry I had no experience in. But I came out here and met the 3 families, and I kind of fell in love with it. It was coming from software where it was all just kind of smoke and mirrors. Everyone's kind of BSing their way through the same, 10-slide deck, asking for a bunch of money. It was so nice to see people just roll up their sleeves, work really hard, go into these plants, understanding these families, how they run their businesses. So that's what brought me out here. And then happy to share like why that whole thing fell apart, but that's how I came out here. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious what drove you when you obviously, you're halfway joking when he asked you, your buddy's dad asked you that question, you say, absolutely not. And then in the next breath, you said, I flew out there and met everybody and kind of like walked around. So did you have an inkling when you said, no, I don't know anything about this, but yeah, let me at least, I don't want to say give it the old college try, but like go out and do some recon, so to speak, not to be cheesy about it, but like what was driving you to do that?
Yeah. So one, it's a friend. So you take what they say, and look, if you put value in it, it's probably worth at least looking through stuff before you decide if you want to go. The next piece of it was, I'm from Texas. So I was over after living in San Francisco and then Chicago. I was over living in these like densely populated urban cities with, 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. Right. So I was looking for something more real. I've always heard amazing things about Montana. I just never been, and I didn't understand how you can kind of sustain being out here. But part of what I was doing is I was looking to invest in a business, and so I did kind of taking the the other side of the coin going from tech is I've always believed, whether it was in ag tech or anything else, there's huge opportunity in middle America, what they call the flyover states. Like that's where the food's coming from. That's where all the stuff's, happening that people don't appreciate. And maybe that's where the arbitrage can happen, where if you find the right opportunity, especially as an investor, because at that point I was just going to invest in these plants and then it really helped them out with the distribution piece and figuring out how to take their model and scale it and kind of, take three separate family owned plants and consolidate them and make into one larger brand. And so it was enough to get me out here. And then I met with them. Then I was going to meat processing conventions. I'm going to meet everyone at the state level to figure out where can I add value when I have no experience in this industry. And that was really around, they're working so hard just to keep the lights on. How can I, and they're running these things as their own small business. So everything's a write-off and they're not really thinking about scaling and growing. It's just too much for them. And so my job was, there's a lot of incentives at the state level. How do I go get them and fill out the paper? How do I go get the money, fill out the paperwork, get them grants, do all the things that can help them scale, and then tie in the branding really around Montana. And that was kind of the genesis of coming out here and kind of figuring that piece out.
What was did you gravitate towards kind of branding and marketing and the story and the kind of cohesiveness of an entire organization in tech, in business school, kind of a combination, or did you see that when you went out there and kind of just pulling from your education and your experience in California and Chicago and saying, oh, this is what's needed here? Do you gravitate towards that naturally, that kind of storytelling?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm not a great storyteller when it comes to my own, stories. But I don't know. I think I intuitively knew this stuff. Now that you mentioned, I don't know if I sat there and walked out of business school like, oh, it's about storytelling. I did pick up and connect the dots, which was I saw a lot of money getting raised with very few slides, mostly around founder stories or their vision, right? And the people that can communicate that well, money just seemed to gravitate towards them, right? And then going to business school and learn some of the frameworks and everything, it did come down to storytelling, whether it was in your pitches, whether it was the person. So I think intuitively I did know that stuff. I'm always been much better at, kind of giving props for other people. So for me, when I came out here, I loved what they were doing. And I thought, well, I'm going to be behind the scenes. It's my job to tell their story. And to me, the story was not just the individual ranch or the processing plant that owned it. It was really the source verified all the way through the supply chain piece. I just don't think, as I really dug into the research here, I just said, look, a lot of these companies, like, and I could just name them, but let's just take ButcherBox for example. That thing's out of Boston, right? A lot of these people are slapping lipstick on something and then trying to tell the story, but there's no real authenticity. And you saw that in software and everything else. And so for me, it was like, wait, there are real people working real, long days, doing this hard work. My job to me was just tell their story and then tell it all the way through the supply chain, because most people don't know where their meat's coming from. There's just no country of origin requirements out there. And most people don't realize, in the research I was doing, that they're getting most of their beef from Brazil or Mexico or Canada, and a lot of cases Australia. They just don't realize that. So there's the story piece of it, which is where's your meat coming from. Then the second piece is like, who's actually doing the work behind this? Like, let's tell their stories. And then the authenticity is real. I mean, these are real ranchers. These are real meat processing plants here in Montana. So it just made sense to me.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? And like, and at that stage, like, your audience is not necessarily the end consumer, right? For that story, right? You're trying to help these organizations, these three organizations that are kind of functioning as one, right? Scale kind of within the state and within the U.S. And so your audience is not necessarily always the end consumer there, right? Like you're telling this story in kind of like that B2B fashion, right?
Yeah, well, at first I just knew the story made sense and it needs to go somewhere. I didn't start putting those pieces together until later on, because again, this is not my industry. I really didn't know. I just thought if the end consumer is walking in, they don't know where their product's from. They should know. But then to your point, it's like, okay, well, they're not the ones that make the decisions on what gets on the shelves. So, okay, then I'm like, well, do the buyers know? Do they care? Like you're kind of just piecing this thing together and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what does it take to, actually make this a compelling story enough where, the story's got to be good, the product's got to be good, the pricing has to be good, and you're putting all this stuff together. And I'm trying to figure all this out. In the 8 months I spent kind of chasing this deal and putting everything together, because then I had to make the decision: is it good enough where I'm going to put really my life savings into this thing? And you're kind of beholden to 3 separate families. Everyone has to be on the same page. It was really hard to put together. Ultimately, we didn't put it together. It's just like every family, they were sort of negotiating against each other because they were valuing their own company. I needed all of them to roll over their equity because we needed their expertise, right? Because that wasn't my background. And so to get them to roll over their equity, and they're all kind of negotiating against themselves on the value of what they think their company is relative to their other company. And then they're all sort of making the same product. So you have to get the plants working. It just became, it was a lot, right? The next generation didn't want to take over for them. They were state inspected plants, labor's tight. I mean, I'm learning all this on the fly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
how did that roll over into Anthem Snacks? Like what were you learning here, or what were you learning there rather, as you're working? And it sounds like drinking water from a fire hose, right? Trying to understand how all of this stuff works. Was there somewhere in there the genesis of the idea for Anthem Snacks? Obviously it's in the same industry in the sense of meat, but where did that come from, and how did you make that jump and bootstrap this yourself?
Yeah, one was, yes. So in the process of learning what we were going to sell, value-added products was at the top of that list, right? So when you run a processing plant, you have to sell everything off that animal. I mean, everything down to the dog treats, right? The bones for the dog treats. And it's a different model. You have to sell everything to keep the lights on. So manufacturing is different than a sales and distribution company. And so I learned some important lessons here. But one of the things I learned was, in the process of doing that, it's really hard. You're in charge of a lot of human beings, right? There's a short labor's tight here. And when you decide you have to sell everything off that animal, even though you have a vision for what your product's going to be, you have to compromise on price, because this stuff has to go somewhere. You got to keep the lights on, right? Versus if you outsource your manufacturing, you kind of stick to your price point, and if it doesn't resonate with them, you just kind of move on, and you kind of maintain that premium value, right? So I think for me, I learned that lesson in doing that. But the other piece of it was, when you're setting up these manufacturing plants and you're kind of going along the way, there's a lot of these things are not USDA inspected. They're all state inspected. So you can't even sell across state lines. And so for me, knowing that the highest value in everything we were going to sell was these value-added products, so snacks was always going to be one of those things, right? So that I hung on to that one thing. And then I realized, well, if I'm trying to start a premium brand, it's very hard to do if my core model is a manufacturing processing plant, right? And so I kind of just put those two things together, and I said, well, okay, the deal's too hard to do. I'm going to walk away from this. But I had been going to meat processing conventions. I had been doing the research on what the products we were going to be able to sell. And to me, I said, okay, well, if I just do the snack side of this, meaning the meat snacks, so sticks and jerky, and if you do sausage or some of this other stuff, I can compound that knowledge over time, right? It's too hard to learn everything else, to sell to restaurants, to sell to C-stores, to sell all this other stuff. And so I hung on to that one thing. I said, let me just do one thing really well, and it'll be easier for me to catch up over time because I'll compound that. The second piece of it is, don't get bogged down in buying a plant to do that one thing, because you don't have a brand right now. So the lights are going to turn on, and immediately the pressure is going to be, how do you pay the bills? Which means instead of selling a premium product, which is what I want to do, I'm now just selling it anywhere just to get this thing, out of my inventory. And then switching out, instead of focusing on their story, which was originally going to be the source verified, the ranching, the processing, I'll just make it about, kind of my story, which is a veteran-owned product. And it was kind of that piece just kind of worked together. And then the choice was, the opportunity cost, which is, I'd been here for 8 months. I've been chasing this thing. I either put more time and effort into going down this path, and it becomes kind of a sunk cost, or I walk away from the whole thing. And that was the decision to make. And I had already kind of fallen in love with Montana. I thought I did enough research into what we were doing, and I thought I had enough of an idea of what this could look like if it had my story on it versus theirs. And so that's a long-winded version, but that's kind of the variables that I looked at.
No, I think it's great, right? And I think it's great for for folks in our community, because a lot of times again, like we started with, we'll come out of the military and we'll say, okay, I want to go do this one thing. I'm going to pour all of this effort into this one thing, right? In your case, it was, California, and then it was Chicago, and then it was Montana. It'd be very easy for you to have been like, man, I've gone on this journey. I've done all of these things. I kind of discovered this thing, but like, I can't just quit now because, I'm not a quitter, and like all these things that are instilled in us, right? That are a part of our ethos within our community, kind of regardless of, where and in what capacity you served. We all have a version of that. So was that difficult for you to look at all of those things and say, okay, now I'm going to pivot and move on to something else? Or did you look at it the way that we just described, which is, I actually learned everything that I needed to learn to move on to this product and this brand that I want to build?
So both is the answer, right? One, I felt high conviction, like, hey, if I do this, I can do it. It was really challenging because one, I didn't do it with my buddy. He ended up investing in one of those meat processing plants, which was probably the more solid bet, right? I'm now throwing my life savings into starting a business. Who needs another jerky company out there, right? It's like you're not offering that much new in the marketplace, and so that part was hard. And so I went from something where I was going to be part of really 3 different families, my buddy and myself, and I was going to be in the back, to now being just me in front of it. That paradigm shift for me was, I had to kind of really, that was the number one thing I had to, make a decision on. The next piece of it was, I had to come up with all this stuff. So it's just you in your head coming up with all this, design work, all this stuff on your own. And then along the way, my dad passed away during COVID unexpectedly. So you're dealing with that. We're trying to find a house to move. I mean, you're just kind of figuring all this stuff out. And when you start hitting that, that's where the resiliency and dealing with the adversity and everything, the military background preps you for. Because you're just like, okay, it's pouring out here. You know what I mean? Like it's not like there's no umbrella, like it's pissing on you. And at that point, to your point, there's no quit. You have high conviction. You have discipline. You believe in what you're doing. And then at that point, you're just trying to put right foot in front of left, get through it. There'll be brighter days on the other side of it. And if you fail, you fail. But what I'm not going to do is, it's my name on it now. That's the other piece. So if I fail, not to say it's like public because nobody knows who we are, but, within your own circles, it's going to be, maybe a little embarrassing, maybe whatever. But the takeaway that I took away from Silicon Valley, which is different than the military, a little bit different, is they actually wore that thing as a badge of honor. They were like, fail quickly, fail 2 times, because then your probability of success on the 3rd time is even that much greater. And so I just kind of wore that, right? And then just kind of focus on, the same things you learn in kind of the special ops community, which is just focus, commit, and adapt along the way, and make the best decisions you can make given the information you have.
So how did you get started? So you're doing everything, right? It's just you. You're, like you said, you're doing design, you're building the brands. You obviously already have these relationships to get the animal that you need, the parts of the animal that you need to make the product. So I would imagine elements of that were, I don't want to say easy, but more simple, right? Kind of based on those relationships that you had built. So how did you immediately build the brand, and where did you start?
Yeah. So the first thing I did was all the relationships I built on getting the animals and all that went out the door, because the issue I was having in the 3 processing plants was that was not scalable. We were going to have to make a major investment these are all old plants from the 60s. They didn't have the capacity to really scale. You had to build a brand new USDA facility that was going to be massive, right? And so what I learned in that process was I honestly, to start out, I was going to have to get myself out of that business. I couldn't be in the buying the animals and doing all that. Or making the jerky and doing all that stuff. I needed to find somebody who was really good at jerky, so I could focus on, and I'm not really good at it, but to focus on storytelling, marketing, sales, distribution. Because if you do both, you're gonna fail miserably when you're a 1-person team, right? And so the first thing I was like, I need to go find somebody. If I do my job right and the story lands with the consumers, I'm not going to do all that work, invest my life savings, only to find out I'm running against capacity issues because I picked a tiny little plant. So I need to go find a big, co-manufacturer that can make the recipes we want to do at scale. So if it lands in the market, we could scale. That was the first thing. The next piece of it was,
sorry, before we move on from that, it's an important piece, right? Finding strategic partnerships is key because we the tendency is for us to say like, okay, well, if I'm bootstrapping this, I have to do all of this myself. I have to put all of this on my shoulders. I have to wear all of this myself because if I do fail, I need to make sure that, I'm the only one who's failing here, right? When in reality, we need to do what you need to do, which is, okay, my uncle always says, and he comes from tech and investing and stuff. He always says, find out what you're not good at and don't do that.
Yeah,
Find
no, that's
somebody
true.
to do the thing that you're not good at. And like in this case, it's not necessarily what you were good or not good at. It was something you recognize that, it was a piece that was missing for you. So you're going to go find that strategic partnership. I just wanted to put a pin in that because I think it's a really important piece.
No, it's really important. The other piece of it was, and again, I learned this in chasing down the processing plants in Montana. The original idea was to be really around Montana beef, right? That was what we were going to do in the supply chain. Well, when I started really digging in and digging into the stack of everything from the feedlots to the kill facilities to the processing, they just don't have the infrastructure here. 90 to 95% of the cattle was actually getting finished in Nebraska or Kansas or somewhere else. It was actually cheaper to bring the food, to bring the animal to the food than the grain to the animal. And so then, which luckily I learned because I wouldn't have known this when I started. So I know I needed a co-manufacturer that could scale, that knew how to make really good jerky, and I could just focus on the recipes and the storytelling. The other piece I realized is don't put all your eggs in one basket trying to get only Montana beef. You're gonna kneecap yourself from the jump, right? So we do regionally sourced beef and all that stuff. Initially, and I had to kind of learn this. Initially, I was trying to leverage all the relationships I had early on where to get the animals to where to get the beef and all that stuff. That really bit me in the butt when we had COVID going on. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but we were already working with United Airlines, and at that point, it was tough to get beef. And I'm not a commodity trader, so these people are buying contracts well in advance, and everything was spot pricing at the time. So I'm locked into a contract with United Airlines where I have to deliver a product. I don't care if COVID's going on or anything. I have to deliver a product at a certain price. And I'm already dealing with all the sales, all the marketing, all the the freight. I had one other guy work with me at that point, actually two, one on marketing and one former teammate of mine that was handling logistics. And so you're having to fulfill all this stuff, and I have to go now buy beef at spot pricing. That's crazy, right? So I gave up that piece and got it off my thing. And I was like, I told my co-manufacturer, this is what you guys do. Here's what I need. I need this kind of beef. It needs to be fresh, all this stuff. And I put that in that hands. But you would think it'd be common sense. I didn't know that. I had to go through that to be like, I'm going to go bankrupt doing this,
Yeah, that's one of the toughest things about being an entrepreneur is that the way you learn lessons is with your own money, right? Like that's yeah. It's. I mean, I obviously I'm on the creative services side of the marketing portion of the industry, and it's like for a long time worked with for a lot of advertising agencies and therefore worked with a lot of clients, and I'm spending other people's money and making mistakes with other people's media spend and their production budgets and their agency fees and all these different things. And then now my wife and I are running our own agency, and we're like, oh yeah, no, this one's on us. Like, that was a $5,000 mistake, $10,000 mistake. Like that's on us. I can't just be like, hey, sorry, I need an overage for $10,000. It's like, no, you fucked that up. So that's on you. You gotta learn that way,
Yeah. I always say they're one-time lessons because when it's your money, you can't afford them to be the same lesson get learned twice.
Yep. That's right. So I think partnerships would be an interesting way to kind of to bring this conversation home. So you'd mentioned United Airlines, and you have a partnership with UFC. It seems like a through line of your story as an entrepreneur is relationship building relationships with not just people and not just vendors, but strategic partners. Can you talk about how you approach partnerships at Anthem Snacks?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's out of necessity, right? I can't go door knocking, down here in Bozeman, every small business, right? Like it's a tiny team. So to me, it was like it was going to cost me the same amount of time and effort to convince one small business owner as one direct to consumer, purchase as one buyer for a retail chain, right? And so if I could go do that, so to me, it was like let's focus on the decision makers at larger companies where I think the story would land. Right. And that we can get the most scale. And so that's kind of what I focused on early on. So it was United Airlines, and I kind of zigged where everyone else was zagging kind of thing. Right. It was like the 800-pound gorilla in our category is Jack Links. They just kind of own the space. there's only a few companies that own, over like 40% of the market, right? So there's a lot of pay to play. It's a very competitive space. And so I just had to figure out where could I be less bullied, if you will, right? And so home improvement, we're in Lowe's home improvement store. We're in Shields outdoor sporting goods store. Tractor Supply will be launching in August. Actually, like today, I think. So anywhere where I thought our story would land and we couldn't just get bullied, right? And so United Airlines was like the first swing at that, and luckily we got that. And once we developed these partnerships, I like to say it's kind of a win-win-win, which is part of our mission is we give 10% of our profits to veteran nonprofits and first responder nonprofits. And so I always tell them, look, you're showing your consumer base, especially if you're like in a convenience store where a lot of the truck drivers coming through are either veterans or they have a certain set of values. How do you communicate, to your customer that you support the veteran community? And so that's working with a veteran-owned company could help. And then working with a veteran-owned company that also gives back profits to, to veteran nonprofits. And then how do we do something together where we actually pick a charity, we actually promote the charity, and we both give back. You put your money where your mouth is, and I'll kind of match it, right? So we did one here for Big Sky Bravery with there's like a 100-store chain called Town Pump, and for every 8-ounce bag, $8 goes back to the charity. So $4 from them, $4 from us, and that's a way for you to show to your community that you care and that you value these things. And it's a way to show that it's a small owned business, that you support small owned, entrepreneurs and small businesses. And that's been pretty well for us. And I take those partnerships very seriously because that's what it really is. It's an investment in us, and we reinvest it back into the community. And that's worked really well. We actually will be announcing here shortly that we just partnered with like Folds of Honor, which is a huge nonprofit organization. And it's a way for us to actually go out there and advocate for the work that's being done in the veteran community and those who serve. And I think that has a place at the table for all the products that are being sold out there. There's a place for that. And I think that resonates with a good amount of people. And that's once they kind of buy into that, we are in partnership, and it's strategic, in value for them, but it means a lot to me because it's not just about the dollars and the P&L for us. It really is about helping these organizations.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that does resonate, and that's really well said. I think, back to what you were talking about with zigging where everyone else was zagging. I mean, I had a long-range shooting instructor used to always tell me, you don't get credit for making it harder on yourself, right? So like, don't go compete in a crowded market where it's hyper competitive. Go where you have to compete with less people. So you're not going to compete with Jack Links with some of these retail partners because they're not there. Great. That's a win for you. And I think another thing that kind of comes from this military mindset, this veteran mindset is like, it's gotta be hard. Like if it's not hard, it's not worth it. You know what I mean? I struggle with that myself. I'm struggling with that at this exact moment as we're having this conversation on some of the things that I'm doing. Like I'm struggling with trying to defeat that mindset of like, no, it doesn't. Yes, there are elements of this that are going to be hard, obviously, and those things should be hard. You need to push through certain things, but all of it doesn't have to be so hard. And you definitely don't need to feed that like, oh, this has got to be so hard mindset as you're working through and solving problems within your business.
Yeah, I mean, so I take my unconventional background, right? Just asymmetric warfare, right? And I that's exactly how I look at it, which is, where is your advantage knowing you're David, not Goliath kind of thing. But the second piece of that is I try to, like we all do, we embrace the grind. And when it's challenging and it is a competitive market, that's good too. Because I honestly look at that thing and I say, well, if I'm working this hard, good luck to the guy behind me, right? Because I'm, so if I could break through all these hurdles that are really meant for the incumbent, well, then that just makes it that much harder for whoever else is trying to get my spot on the peg. Right. And so I just embrace that. It's really those two things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I love it. Okay, so you mentioned a couple of things that are going to be launching here this summer to today. This episode is going to go live at the end of this month, end of August, kind of going into September. So what's the summer and early fall looking like? You already mentioned a couple. Anything else that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I mean, without giving it away too much, I am trying to get to really what we started out to do, which is I want to get to the source verified if I could do a single ranch or a couple of ranchers with an actual product that is from Montana. So we just launched sticks here a couple of months ago. That's all American beef and all that stuff, which is good because, like I said, most people don't know where their meat's coming from and their beef's coming from. But I want to even get more specific with that. And there's actually a first generation rancher out here that's a former Navy SEAL. Zach, you should actually have him on the podcast. His name is Greg Putnam. So he works for a Little Belt Cattle Company. I'll make the intro for you. And so we're trying to get to a place where he would supply our beef, right? And then I have to show that this thing scales, obviously, that he can supply enough. But we'd probably come out with what we'll call like a Montana stick, something around that. It'll be bigger stick, and then it'll be co-branded, so we can really tell his story, right? Because at the end of the day, I want people to know where their product comes from, where their beef actually comes from, right? And there's a lot of tricks that these people play, meaning these other look. There's 4 big meat packers in the country, right? 2 of them are owned really by Brazilian companies. They own 85% of the market. And then there's like all these tricks that get played at these processing plants where they repackage stuff and then they say it's made in the USA and all this other stuff. And it's all, quite frankly, it's pretty disgusting, to be honest, that they do that with the stories. I wanted to show the guy that's on the horse, with the cattle and telling his story. And the fact that he just happens to be a veteran is that much cooler, right? And then we can tell the Montana story. So that's what I'm really focused on. Hopefully by the end of the year, launching that. That'll be a big win for us because, again, I think it tells the Montana story. It really leans into the veteran piece, and then it shows all the hard work that those guys are doing, which would be awesome.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a great opportunity to be cross-cultural, right? Like I think in our community, the veteran community, which has some overlap with the outdoor community, shooting community, all these different things, right? Like we actually do value, organic where we can, regenerative where we can, grown and finished here in the United States, and not kind of having that very corporate elitist mentality for the clothing that we wear and the food that we eat and all these different things. So there's this actually really great opportunity to bridge a cultural divide, I think, in the country through, something as simple as meat snacks.
For sure. I mean, you see the big push on getting manufacturing back here in the U.S., which is a whole other thing. But this is one of the things that just can't be made in China, right?
Yeah.
And so it's all here. I just don't think people know what they're eating. If they really knew what they were eating, they would care more, right?
Yeah.
And that's just about telling the stories and doing that. And so that's a big piece of what I want to do here in the next, let's call it 6 months.
I love it. Well, I think we're probably due for another conversation. We should definitely do this again, towards the end of the year or the beginning of next year, and tell more of that story and talk about how that unfolds, or how it did unfold rather, when we get there. Nate, to end each episode of the podcast, I ask an open-ended question. What's on your heart and what's on your mind for our community right now? Could be a piece of advice, something you want to get off your chest, or something you want to reiterate from what we've talked about today. But Nate, what's on your heart? What's on your mind?
Yeah, my thing is, so being a wounded veteran, I've kind of seen both sides of this thing, where obviously between the suicide rate and seeing the homelessness happening in our community, and seeing the kind of the GWAT era, obviously wind down, and what's next for everyone. I like to focus on really the underutilized veterans, right? I think there's just so much value in what we offer, especially in a very polarizing world. I think you really need vets out there that know the consequences of decisions that are being made, understand the values. Like when you're in the military, you have to work with everyone. You can't really pick sides and everything else. So I think it's extremely valuable, and it's a big piece of why I want to work with Folds of Honor and everything else. I think transitioning veterans is so important, but telling their stories on the success stuff is really important. There's amazing companies out there, a lot of special ops guys that are doing tactical stuff, all that stuff. That's awesome. But that's a natural transition. We're not all doing that stuff. I think it's super important to show the positive impact that's happening, getting them into the business world, veterans, getting them into education, getting them into politics where they can serve, whatever the case may be. And so my job, I just feel like, is being one small piece of that, to showing that there are successful veteran-led, veteran-founded companies that are out there that can compete in the marketplace, and that could use what we have in our background and our experience going forward. And so that's that's the purpose I find.
Well said. I love it. Where can folks find, for those that, obviously there's retail partners, but you do have a D2C element, where can folks go to purchase Anthem Snacks?
Yep. So it's just at anthemsnacks.com or at Anthem Snacks on IG or Facebook.
Awesome. I love it. Nate, appreciate you. Appreciate your work. Appreciate your snacks. I love them. I was telling Paige, my daughter loves them. She's a big beef jerky fan, and so she crushed a couple bags very quickly when we got them. So thank you.
Nice. Yeah, no, awesome. And yeah, appreciate you having me on. So I think the work you're doing is amazing too.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you. We'll chat soon.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.